The heat of the day clung to the valley floor long after the sun had bled out behind the western peaks. It rose from the packed earth in waves, thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and cheap whiskey. Lanterns strung between the livery and the general store cast a jittery golden light over the makeshift dance floor, turning the swirling skirts of the townswomen into frantic moths. For An Lee, the air was a weight, pressing down on her dark red dress, making the fine cotton stick to her skin. She had come to this town seeking anonymity, a place so remote and raw that the ghosts of San Francisco could not follow. She had found only a different kind of cage, one made of staring eyes and a crushing, profound loneliness. The fiddle music sawed at the nerves, a cheerful violence against the vast, indifferent silence of the surrounding wilderness. She held a cup of lukewarm lemonade, the tartness doing little to cut through the dryness in her throat. She watched the dancers, the laughing, flushed faces of women who belonged here, whose histories were written in the lines of this hard land. Her own history was a secret she guarded like a shriveled seed, something she feared would never find soil in which to grow. He emerged from the deep shadows near the blacksmith's forge, a place where the light of the lanterns seemed to die. He did not walk so much as move through the crowd like a force of nature, a slow river parting stones. He was immense, a man built of the mountain itself, with shoulders that strained the seams of his simple homespun shirt. A wild, dark beard fell across his chest, and his hair, the same deep brown, was tied back from his face with a leather thong. He did not smile or swagger. He simply observed, his eyes holding the stillness of the deep forest pool. He stopped before her. The noise of the party seemed to recede, muffled by his sheer presence. He smelled of pine and clean earth and something metallic like cold spring water. He did not offer a flowery greeting, no preamble or pleasantry. He simply looked at her, then held out a hand. It was a huge hand, calloused and mapped with scars, but the gesture was not demanding. It was an invitation. An Lee looked at that hand, then up at his steady, unreadable face. Fear was a constant companion, but for the first time in months, another feeling stirred alongside it. Curiosity. She placed her small hand in his, and the strength in his grip was immediate, a solid anchor in the swirling chaos. He led her onto the packed dirt of the dance floor, and the town seemed to melt away at the edges. They moved to the rhythm of the fiddle, a slow, circling waltz. He did not speak. There was no need. His guidance was firm, unerring. For a woman who had spent a year feeling adrift, the solid wall of his chest was a strange and welcome shore. She could feel the power held in check in his arms, the quiet confidence in his step. He was not a creature of this town, of these flimsy wooden buildings and their loud, desperate festivities. He was a piece of the wilderness that tolerated their existence at its edge. She found herself breathing in time with him, her gaze fixed on the rough weave of his shirt. A fragile sense of peace began to settle over her, a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. It was then, over his shoulder, that she saw him, a ghost from her past, made of flesh and tailored silk. Mr. Fang. He stood at the edge of the lantern light, a glass of brandy in his hand, his narrow eyes sweeping the crowd with an air of predatory ownership. He wore his wealth like a weapon, the polished boots, the waistcoat, the glint of a gold watch chain. His smile was a thin, cruel line she had seen in her nightmares. He had not seen her yet, but it was only a matter of seconds. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the delicate bubble of her newfound calm. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against a cage. All the miles she had traveled, all the privations she had endured had been for nothing. He had found her. Her breath caught, a strangled knot in her throat. The world tilted, the cheerful lantern light turning sinister. Graham, the mountain man, must have felt the change in her, the sudden, rigid terror that shot through her body. His steps slowed, his hand tightening slightly on hers. His gaze followed hers, and she saw his eyes settle on Thang. He saw the expensive suit, the arrogant posture, the way the man surveyed the scene as if it were all his to purchase or discard. He saw him, and then he looked back down at her. He saw the naked fear in her eyes, the desperate plea she could not voice. He saw her composure shatter like fine porcelain. She leaned in, her lips brushing the rough fabric of his shirt, the whisper a ghost of a sound beneath the music. "Help me," she breathed, the words tasting of ash. "He is here. Please." She did not know this man. He was a stranger, a giant pulled from the mountain's shadow. For all she knew, he could be as cruel as the one she fled. But the quiet solidity she had felt in his arms was her only hope. She was asking him to step into a fire he had not started, to take on a danger that was not his. She expected him to hesitate, to question, to pull away. He did none of those things. His expression did not change, but a new intensity sharpened his eyes. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a promise of comfort. It was an acceptance of fact. Without a word, he shifted his position, turning his broad back to Fang, effectively erasing the man from her line of sight. His arm, which had rested lightly on her waist, moved with purpose, his hand settling firmly on the small of her back. He was no longer guiding her in a dance. He was shielding her. He did not break the rhythm of the waltz. To any casual observer, they were still just another couple circling the floor. But the movement had changed. It was no longer a dance, but a strategic retreat. With each step, he guided her farther from the center of the celebration, deeper into the periphery where the shadows lay thick and cool. He used his size as a barrier, a moving wall of muscle and bone that kept her hidden. The fiddle music grew fainter, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the whisper of a breeze through the tall pines that crowded the edge of the settlement. They reached the last sputtering lantern, and then they were in the dark. He did not release her. His hand remained a warm, steady pressure on her back, urging her forward, away from the noise and the light and the man who had come to claim her. The path he took was not a path at all, but a barely discernible track that led straight up the slope behind the town. The ground was uneven, littered with loose stones and tangled roots. Anli's dancing slippers, so practical on the packed earth of the party, were useless here. She stumbled once, her ankle turning, but he was there before she could fall, his free hand catching her elbow, steadying her without breaking stride. He did not speak, and she did not either. There were no words for this strange, silent flight. There was only the sound of their breathing, the crunch of their footsteps on the dry ground, and the immense, star-dusted canopy of the night sky above. This was his world. The air grew cooler, cleaner, scented with pine needles and damp earth. He moved with an easy, powerful gait, as certain of his footing in the darkness as if it were broad daylight. They climbed for what felt like an hour, the sounds of the town completely vanishing behind them, swallowed by the mountain. Finally, he stopped in a small clearing. A cabin stood there, nestled amongst a stand of ancient pines. It was a simple, stark structure, built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a single window that was dark and empty. It looked less like a home and more like a temporary shelter, something a man might use and then abandon. He released her, his hand falling away from her back, and the absence of his touch left her feeling suddenly cold and exposed. He pushed open the heavy plank door, which swung inward with a low groan. He gestured for her to enter. Inside, the cabin was as sparse as its exterior promised. Moonlight slanting through the open door revealed a packed earth floor, a stone hearth black with soot, a simple cot covered with a thick fur pelt, and a rough wooden table with a single chair. It was the home of a man who owned nothing, who needed nothing. Graham moved to the hearth and with practiced efficiency struck a flint and steel. A tiny spark caught in the tinder, and soon a small, controlled fire was crackling, casting a warm, dancing light across the small room. He filled a tin cup with water from a bucket and handed it to her. She took it, her hands trembling slightly, and drank. The water was icy cold and tasted of stone. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She looked at him then, truly looked at him in the flickering firelight. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, but his eyes were clear and direct. There was no artifice in him. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a man of the mountain, solitary and self-sufficient. He had asked for no explanation, no story. He had seen her fear and acted. That simple, uncomplicated fact was more profound than any declaration. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet in the stillness of the cabin. He gave another one of his slight nods, his attention on the fire. "He will look for you." It was not a question, it was a statement. "Yes," she confirmed. "He will not give up easily." "You are safe here," he said. The words were plain, unadorned, but they carried the weight of an unbreakable vow. He gestured to the cot. "Rest." He himself took the single chair, leaning it back against the wall, and folded his powerful arms across his chest. He would watch over her while she slept. An Lee lay down on the cot, pulling the heavy fur over her. It smelled faintly of him, of pine and wood smoke. She did not cry. She did not allow herself the luxury of relief. But as she closed her eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady, quiet sound of the mountain man's breathing, a sliver of hope, something she thought had died long ago, took root in the barren soil of her heart. This was an endurance test, she knew, not just of the body, but of the spirit. And for the first time, she did not feel she was facing it alone. The next morning, dawn broke not as a gentle suggestion, but as a sharp, clean line of silver light over the eastern ridge. An Lee woke to the smell of brewing chicory and the sight of Graham standing by the open door, a silhouette against the brightening sky. He had not slept in the chair. He had been watching the trail. He passed her a steaming mug without a word. The drink was bitter and hot, and it shocked her system into full awareness. The cabin, in the light of day, was even more Spartan than it had appeared at night. Every object had a purpose. An axe leaning by the door, a well-cared-for skinning knife on the table, a few tin plates stacked neatly on a shelf. It was the home of a man who traveled light through life. She expected questions. She expected him to demand the story that had led her to his door. But he asked for nothing. He moved about his morning chores with a quiet economy of motion, checking the snares he had set nearby, chopping firewood with powerful, precise swings of his axe. An Lee watched him, and a slow realization dawned. He was not testing her with questions. He was testing her with silence. He was waiting to see who she was when no one was demanding anything of her. She could have stayed on the cot, a helpless guest. Instead, she rose, smoothed the wrinkles from her red dress, and looked for something to do. She found a worn broom made of bound twigs and began to sweep the dirt floor, the rhythmic scrape of the branches a comforting, domestic sound. She straightened the furs on the cot. She washed their 2 mugs in the water bucket. They did not speak, but a language passed between them in these simple, shared tasks. Her quiet industry was an answer to his silent observation. She was not a fragile doll to be protected. She was a survivor. He returned from his snares with 2 rabbits, and he skinned them with a surgeon's precision. He cooked the meat over the fire on green sticks, and they ate sitting on the floor by the hearth, the silence companionable now, not tense. The meat was savory, seasoned only with salt and fire, and it filled her with a strength she hadn't felt in months. After they ate, she took out a small sewing kit she always carried and began to repair a tear in her dress from the previous night's flight. Her stitches were small and even, a testament to a life that had taught her to care for what little she possessed. He watched her fingers work for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Late in the afternoon, the sound they had both been expecting finally came. The sound of horses, several of them, making their way clumsily up the mountain trail. Graham did not startle. He simply rose to his feet, his body seeming to expand to fill the small cabin. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice low. He picked up the heavy axe from beside the door, not as a weapon, but as a tool he happened to be holding. It looked like a toy in his massive hand. He stepped outside, pulling the door partially closed behind him, leaving her in the dim interior. An Li went to the single small window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutter. 3 men rode into the clearing. Mr. Fang was in the lead, his fine city clothes looking absurdly out of place amongst the pines. He was flanked by 2 hired men, rough-looking drifters whose hands hovered near the pistols on their hips. Fang dismounted, his face a mask of smug fury. He surveyed the poor cabin with a sneer. "This is where you hide?" he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "With him? A savage who lives in a mud hut?" He looked at Graham, dismissing him as nothing more than an obstacle, a piece of wilderness to be cleared. "I have come for what is mine. Give me the girl, and I will let you keep your miserable life." Graham stood before the cabin, silent and still as a granite boulder. He did not raise his voice. He did not posture. He simply existed, a bulwark between Fang and the door. "She is not yours," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried with absolute finality. It was the sound of a mountain refusing to move. Fang laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Everything can be bought. Name your price, animal." He reached into his waistcoat as if to pull out a wallet. "She is with me," Graham repeated. The words were simple, but they redefined the world. It was not a statement of possession like Fang's. It was a statement of alliance, of sanctuary. That was when Fang's patience broke. The thin veneer of civilization cracked, revealing the ugly ambition beneath. "Then we will take her," he snarled, nodding to his men. The 2 drifters dismounted, drawing their pistols. They advanced on Graham, their movements confident, used to intimidating men with the threat of violence. They saw a single large man with a wood-chopping axe. They did not see the truth. Graham did not move backward. He did not raise the axe to a defensive position. He took a single step forward, and the ground seemed to tremble. The air crackled with a sudden, lethal stillness. He was no longer just a large man. He was a predator in his own territory, and they had just realized their mistake. The men hesitated. Their bravado faltered in the face of his absolute lack of fear. He moved then, with a speed that was shocking for a man his size. It was not a brawl. It was a dismantling. He did not use the axe. He did not need to. He took the pistol from the first man's hand with a twist of his wrist that made the man cry out, the crack of bone sharp in the quiet air. The gun clattered to the ground. He turned to the second man, whose eyes were wide with shock, and a single open-handed shove sent the man stumbling back into his horse, which shied and reared in panic. It was over in less than 5 seconds. The display was not one of rage, but of pure, terrifying competence. It was the calm, efficient power of a force of nature, like an avalanche or a flood. Mr. Fang stood frozen, his mouth agape. All his power, his money, his tailored suits meant nothing here. They were useless trinkets in the face of this raw, elemental man. Graham turned his gaze on him, and for the first time Fang looked truly afraid. Graham walked toward him, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped a foot away, towering over him. He did not touch him. He simply looked down at him, and in that gaze was all the contempt the mountain held for the petty squabbles of men. "Leave," Graham said. The word was not a suggestion. It was an order that rearranged the atoms in the air. "Do not come back." Fang, his face pale and slick with sweat, scrambled back onto his horse. He gathered his humiliated men, one of them cradling a broken wrist, and they fled, crashing back down the trail they had so arrogantly climbed. They did not look back. Graham watched them go, his posture unchanging until the last sound of their horses had faded into the forest. Only then did he seem to relax, the immense tension leaving his shoulders. He turned and saw An Li standing in the doorway, her sewing kit clutched in her hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She had seen it all. She had seen his power and his restraint. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was heavy with the aftermath of violence, with the finality of her past being severed. The immediate danger was gone, but the future was a vast, terrifying unknown. She was bound to this man now, not by force, but by the debt of her safety. She owed him her life, and she did not know what payment he would ask. He walked over to the woodpile, picked up a log, and with a single clean stroke split it with the axe. The sharp crack echoed in the clearing. He did not look at her. He seemed to be giving her space, allowing the tremors of the confrontation to settle within her. She watched his powerful back, the muscles moving beneath his shirt as he worked. He had faced down her demon, had broken her cage, and he had done it without a single boast or demand. He had simply acted. The Spartan cabin, which had seemed a symbol of poverty, now felt like something else entirely, a crucible. A place stripped of all pretense, where only true character mattered. She had been tested, and so had he. He had proven his strength, but more importantly, he had proven his control. He was not a brute. He was a guardian. Finally, he stopped his work. He set the axe down and turned to face her. The afternoon sun filtered through the pines, dappling his face in light and shadow. "This is not my home," he said, his voice gentle. "The real one. Come." He held out his hand, the same hand he had offered her on the dance floor. It seemed a lifetime ago. She hesitated for only a second. Then she placed her hand in his. A conscious choice this time. An act of trust, not desperation. He led her not down the mountain, but further up, along a narrow trail that snaked behind the cabin, a path she hadn't noticed before. They climbed higher, the trees thinning until they were walking along a high, windswept ridge. The air was thin and sharp. He led her to the very crest of the ridge, a threshold of rock and sky. And then he stopped. "Look," he said. An Li stepped forward and looked down. Her breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. Below them, nestled in a hidden valley she could never have imagined existed, was a world. It was not a mere homestead. It was a sprawling, prosperous ranch. A long, sturdy house built of dark timber and river stone sat at its center, smoke curling from 2 chimneys. A huge barn, painted a deep, rich red, stood beside it, and wide fenced pastures stretched out across the valley floor. Dozens of cattle grazed contentedly, and in a far corral, fine-looking horses moved with restless grace. A creek, sparkling like a silver ribbon, wound its way through the entire property, feeding fields of green hay. It was a place of deep, quiet wealth. Not the flashy, arrogant wealth of Mr. Fang, but the solid, earned prosperity of hard work, smart planning, and a deep understanding of the land. It was a kingdom hidden behind a mountain. She turned to look at him, her mind struggling to reconcile the man in the threadbare shirt with the master of this hidden paradise. The simple cabin below was a lie, but it was a lie that told the truth. It was a filter, a place to see who people were when they thought he had nothing, a place to find peace from the responsibilities that waited in the valley. "Why?" she whispered, the question encompassing everything. "The world is full of men like Fang," Graham said, his gaze on the valley. His valley. They see land, cattle, a big house. They see what they can take. I come up here, he gestured back toward the simple cabin, to remember what is real, to be where a person's worth is not measured by their purse. He finally looked at her, and his eyes held a raw vulnerability she had not seen before. "I saw you at that dance. You were not looking for a rich man. You were looking for a safe harbor. I wanted to see if the harbor was all you needed." Anli understood. He hadn't just been testing her resilience. He had been testing her heart. He had shown her poverty to see if she would show kindness. He had offered her protection to see if she would offer partnership. She had passed the test without ever knowing she was taking it. The magnificent view below was beautiful, but it was not what made her heart ache with a feeling so profound it was almost painful. It was the man beside her. The man who hid his kingdom not out of shame, but to protect its integrity. The man who valued character over coin, silence over empty words. She thought of her past, of the gilded cage Mr. Fang had tried to build around her, and she looked at the vast, open valley below. This was not a cage. It was a sanctuary, built by a man who understood the meaning of freedom. She let go of his hand and took a step closer to him, her feet firm on the rocky ground. She looked up at his strong, weathered face. "The harbor is enough," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But I think I would like to help tend the lighthouse, too." A slow smile spread across Graham's face, transforming his rugged features, making his eyes crinkle at the corners. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it was like the sun breaking over the ridge. He did not say a word. He simply reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. In that one small, tender gesture, a whole future was decided. Down below, the lights of the house in the valley began to glow, one by one, a warm and welcoming gold against the approaching dusk. It was her home now. They would be married before the first snow fell, not with the loud fanfare of the town, but quietly, on the mountain that had brought them together, a union as solid and enduring as the stone beneath their feet.